It was me. I was the one. On the steps of the county courthouse with the midday sun beating down, it was my hands that hoisted the town's beloved Virgin Mary statue over my head. And it was me who brought it crashing down onto the concrete. The sound, it wasn't just a crack. It was a violent explosion of porcelain, a sound that ripped through the quiet air of our small town square and silenced everything. That shattering sound was my sermon. It was my final triumphant declaration against what I had preached against for 30 years, the great, deceptive sin of idolatry. My name is Jeanette, and for most of my 58 years I was known as Pastor Jeanette. My husband, Pastor David, stood just a few feet away, his face a mask of grim approval, leading our congregation in a roar of support for what they saw as my courage. But across the square I saw Miss Eleanor, the matriarch of our town's Catholic community, a woman whose quiet faith was as old as the town itself. I watched her sink to her knees, her hands flying to her mouth in a silent gasp, the rosary beads I so despised slipping through her trembling fingers as she began to weep. My life up to that point had been a fortress built of scripture, of unshakable conviction, and I see now, of impenetrable pride. I grew up in a home where the Word of God was law. It was our bread, our water, our very breath. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for doubt. There was only the singular, narrow path to salvation, and I walked it with a rigid certainty that I mistook for strength. When David and I founded our church, the Chapel of the Unvarnished Truth, it was with the mission to strip away the traditions and rituals that we believed had corrupted the pure message of the gospel. And in our town, the most visible symbol of that corruption was the statue of Mary that stood in the public square, a gift to the town decades ago by the St. Jude Catholic Church. To me, it was a graven image, a plaster and paint temptation that drew people's worship away from the one true God. It was a spiritual cancer, and I saw it as my divine duty to cut it out. Before you continue, if this story is already stirring something within you, if you've ever been so certain of your own beliefs, I ask you to please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. Ring that notification bell too, so you don't miss the rest of my testimony. It truly helps these stories find their way to the hearts that need to hear them, and I would be so honored to know where my words are landing. Please, leave a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to feel connected to you as I share the rest of this. The day I destroyed that statue wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was planned. It was a sermon delivered not with words, but with action. For weeks I had preached against it from my pulpit, calling it an idol, a doll for grown-ups playing make-believe with their salvation. I saw the hurt in the eyes of my Catholic neighbors at the grocery store, the way they'd cross the street to avoid me. I didn't care. I believed their hurt was a sign of their spiritual sickness, and I was the bitter medicine they needed. On that day, we marched from our chapel to the town square, singing hymns of spiritual warfare. My heart wasn't filled with hate. It was filled with a terrifying, self-righteous fire. I truly believed I was doing God's work. As I stood over the glittering white and blue fragments, the crowd of my opponents surged forward, their faces twisted with a mixture of anguish and pure rage. I wasn't afraid. I felt anointed. I pointed down at the wreckage, at the serene face of the statue now split in two, and I shouted, my voice raw with conviction. "See? It's nothing! It's just plaster and paint. It has no power." To prove my point, to drive the nail into the coffin of their faith, I drew back my foot and kicked a large shard of the porcelain, sending it skittering across the stone. I wanted to show them how fragile their faith was, how easily it could be broken. I stood there, expecting their anger to crumble into disillusionment. I expected them to see the truth I had just revealed. But what happened next was not something my theology, my pride, or my entire life had prepared me for. What happened next was the beginning of my own destruction and my only path to being found. But my victory was a flash of lightning in a silent gathering storm. As I stood there, panting, my heart hammering with righteous adrenaline, a new sound began to rise from the crowd. It wasn't the roar of my supporters or the cries of the outraged. It was a collective gasp, a murmur that rippled through the square like a wave. And then, the smell hit me. It wasn't the dust of shattered plaster or the faint scent of summer blossoms from the park. It was roses. An impossible, overwhelming fragrance of fresh-cut roses, so thick and real it felt like you could taste it. It bloomed from the wreckage at my feet, a living scent that had no earthly source. It clung to the air, silencing the shouts, calming the anger, and filling the space with a holy, terrifying stillness. I watched, my blood turning to ice, as people in the crowd, my opponents, and even some of my own flock, slowly sank to their knees, not in defeat, but in awe. My husband, David, grabbed my arm, his face pale and confused. "What is this trickery?" he hissed. But I knew. In the deepest part of my soul, the part I had kept locked away under layers of doctrine and pride, I knew this was no trick. This was a response. And it was not for me. The days that followed were a blur of hollow triumph. Our church celebrated. We held a special service, praising God for the victory over idolatry. David preached a fiery sermon about how the devil uses signs and wonders to deceive the faithful, calling the scent of roses a deceptive floral bewitchment. Our congregation ate it up. They felt like soldiers who had won a great battle. But I felt like a fraud. Every night I would lie awake, the phantom scent of roses haunting my senses. My prayers, once a confident dialogue with a God who I knew, agreed with me, became hollow monologues. The scriptures I had once wielded like a sword now felt like a book of dead letters in my hands. I felt a profound and terrifying silence from the heavens. The God who had felt so close, so affirming on the courthouse steps, was gone. There was only a vast echoing emptiness where his voice used to be. About a month after the incident, the hollowness had settled into a permanent ache in my chest. I was driving home from a hospital visit with one of our elderly church members. It was late and a heavy rain was falling, turning the country road into a slick black mirror. My mind was churning, replaying the scene in the town square for the 1000th time. I saw Miss Eleanor's face, her silent tears. I saw the crowd on their knees. And then, it happened again. Inside the closed car, the scent of roses bloomed, so powerful it made my eyes water. It wasn't a memory this time. It was real. It filled the small space, thick and suffocating. A wave of panic, cold and absolute, washed over me. My hands clenched the steering wheel. My breath caught in my throat. I was so disoriented, so consumed by this supernatural invasion of my senses that I didn't see the deer until it was right there. A pair of wide, terrified eyes captured in my headlights. I swerved. The tires lost their grip on the wet asphalt. The world became a violent, spinning chaos of metal, glass, and darkness. And then, nothing. I woke up to a different kind of silence. Not the vast, empty silence of God, but a muffled, sterile quiet, punctuated by the rhythmic, indifferent beep of a machine. The world was a blurry landscape of white. White ceiling, white walls, white sheets. A sharp, searing pain shot up from my leg, and a dull, crushing weight pressed on my chest. I was in a hospital, broken. My right leg was in a cast, suspended in the air. I later learned I had 3 broken ribs and a concussion. David was there, sitting by my bed, his Bible open in his lap. He read Psalms to me, his voice a low, comforting rumble. But his words, the very words that had been the bedrock of my entire existence, couldn't reach me. They were just sounds, bouncing off the hard shell of my pain and fear. When he left that night, the real terror began. Alone in the dark, with only the beeping of the heart monitor for company, I understood what true abandonment felt like. I, Pastor Jeanette, the woman who had all the answers, the spiritual warrior, was utterly and completely helpless. I tried to pray. I squeezed my eyes shut and begged, "God, where are you? Please, I'm scared." But there was nothing. No fire, no conviction, no comfort. Just the cold, hard reality of my own broken body and the crushing weight of a silent heaven. The pride that had carried me to the courthouse steps was gone, shattered as completely as the porcelain statue. And for the first time, I was afraid to die. I was afraid that I had been wrong about everything, and that I would face eternity with nothing but the echo of my own empty sermons. If you've ever felt that kind of deafening silence in your own life, that feeling of being completely broken and alone, please, let this story be a small light for you. A simple like on this video, and making sure your notifications are on helps more than you can imagine. It lets me know that this testimony is reaching hearts that understand this part of the journey. The 3rd night in the hospital was the longest night of my life. Painkillers made my thoughts swim in a thick fog, but they couldn't touch the real pain, the one that had taken root in my soul. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the statue shattering. I saw Miss Eleanor's face crumple in sorrow. And then I would hear the silence, that terrible, divine silence. I was in a tomb of my own making, a white-walled sepulchre with a soundtrack of beeping machines that measured a life I no longer felt was worth living. I remember turning my head on the stiff pillow, the effort sending a jolt of fire through my ribs, and looking out the window at the black, starless sky. "So this is it," I whispered to the empty room. "This is how it ends. You were right all along. I'm just plaster and paint. Break me. I don't care anymore." It wasn't a prayer of surrender. It was a dare, a final pathetic act of defiance from a soul that had run out of road. And then, the air in the room changed. It's so hard to describe. The sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital began to fade, and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor seemed to recede, as if I were listening to it from underwater. A soft, pearlescent light began to gather in the corner of the room near the window. It wasn't an electric light. It was alive, gentle, and it didn't cast any shadows. I thought, this must be the medication, a hallucination. My rational mind, the pastor's mind, tried to fight it, to categorize it, to dismiss it. But my heart knew. It stopped hammering in my chest and grew still, waiting. The light didn't take a form, not a human one, but I felt a presence within it, a distinctly feminine presence, radiating a sorrow so deep and a love so vast that it was physically painful to feel. It was the grief of a mother for a foolish, lost child. I couldn't see a face, but I saw hands. Two beautiful, graceful hands emerging from the heart of the light, and in those hands they were holding fragments of broken blue and white porcelain. My breath hitched in my throat. It was the statue. The hands were not accusing me. They were carefully, tenderly, piecing the shards back together. As one piece clicked into place against another, I felt a corresponding click inside my own shattered spirit. A broken rib seemed to settle. A piece of my fractured pride dissolved into dust. A shard of my own stony heart was being gently put back where it belonged. And then, the scent returned. The roses. But this time, it wasn't an overwhelming assault. It was a gentle, comforting perfume that filled the room, a scent of pure, unmerited grace. I began to weep, not the angry, frustrated tears I had shed before, but silent, hot tears of shame and release. The shame was scalding. I saw my whole life of spiritual arrogance laid bare. The mockery, the pride, the cruelty I had mistaken for conviction. It was all there. But as soon as the shame rose, the love from the light would wash over it, extinguishing it like water on a flame, leaving behind not condemnation, but a clean, quiet peace. I felt no words, heard no voice, but a message was imprinted on my soul, clearer than any sermon I had ever preached. You are broken, but you are not beyond repair. You are loved. Just as quietly as it had appeared, the light faded. The beeping of the monitor returned to its normal rhythm. The smell of antiseptic reclaimed the air. But the room was no longer empty. The silence was no longer a void. It was a presence, a peaceful, listening silence. I lay there for I don't know how long, my tears drying on my cheeks, feeling a fragile, terrifying new sensation. Hope. A little while later, the door creaked open. A nurse I hadn't seen before came in. She was older, with kind, tired eyes and gentle hands. "Just checking on you, honey," she said softly. "You had a rough night." She fluffed my pillow, adjusted my blanket, and gave me a small cup of water with a straw. Her touch was so simple, so human, but it felt like a continuation of the grace I had just experienced. As she leaned over to check the IV drip in my arm, a small silver chain swung from her neck. On it was a tiny oval medal. I squinted in the dim light to see the image stamped on it. It was a woman standing on a globe, with rays of light coming from her outstretched hands. It was the miraculous medal. It was her, the mother with the mending hands. My eyes filled with tears again. The nurse saw them. "Are you in pain?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I shook my head, unable to speak. I could only look at her, at the small silver confirmation of a mercy I had done nothing to deserve. She patted my hand. "You just rest now. The morning is almost here." And she was right. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I knew the sun was going to rise. If this part of my story, this moment of finding a little light in the deepest darkness, resonates with you, I would be so grateful if you would give this video a like and make sure your notifications are turned on. It's a small gesture, but it helps these testimonies of hope reach those who might be sitting in their own dark room, right now, waiting for the morning. The doctors called my physical recovery remarkable. "Broken bones," they said, "knit together faster than they'd expected." I was home within a few weeks, hobbling around on a crutch, the casts and bandages a visible testament to the ordeal. But they couldn't see the real fracture, the one that ran through the very bedrock of my soul. In the quiet of my home, away from the sterile reassurances of the hospital, the war inside me began in earnest. My mind, the logical, theological mind of Pastor Jeanette, scrambled for an explanation for what I had seen. It was the morphine, I told myself. A well-documented side effect, a textbook trauma response. The brain, under extreme duress, creates comforting narratives to protect itself. It was a hallucination, nothing more. I had preached for 30 years about the wiles of the enemy, how he could appear as an angel of light, quoting scripture to prove it. Was this his masterpiece? A beautiful floral deception, a vision of false comfort and maternal love, designed specifically to prey on my weakness and lead me astray. I clung to these explanations like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. They were the only things that made sense in the world I had built. But the deception, if that's what it was, wouldn't leave me alone. It followed me home. I'd be sitting in my study, surrounded by my commentaries and concordances, my Bible open to Paul's letters, trying to find the old fire, the old certainty. And suddenly, the scent of roses would fill the room, faint but undeniable, a ghost of a fragrance that made the words on the page swim before my eyes. Or I would close my eyes to pray, forcing the familiar words through my lips. And instead of the throne room of heaven, I would see those hands, luminous and graceful, gently mending the blue and white porcelain. It wasn't a memory that was fading over time. It was a fresh encounter every single time, as real and present as the crutch leaning against my chair. It chipped away at my rationalizations, day by day, leaving me raw and exposed. With each encounter, the shame grew hotter, more unbearable. I started to remember things with a horrifying clarity. I remembered standing on my pulpit a year earlier, holding up a rosary I'd bought at a thrift store just to mock it. I called it a spiritual crutch, a string of beads for the spiritually weak who can't pray without a script. I remember the smattering of laughter from my congregation. I remembered telling Miss Eleanor to her face during a town meeting about holiday decorations that her devotion to Mary was a subtle, venomous idolatry that put her immortal soul in peril. I saw the deep, quiet hurt in her eyes, a hurt I had dismissed as conviction of her sin. Most of all, I saw myself on those courthouse steps, my face contorted with righteous fury, drawing back my foot and kicking the broken face of the statue, shouting for all to hear, "It's just plaster and paint." The arrogance of it, the sheer blind pride of that moment, burned me from the inside out. I had wanted to shatter a symbol, but I had only succeeded in shattering a gentle old woman's heart, and in doing so, I had shattered my own. If you've ever felt that kind of war inside yourself, that terrible friction caught between what you were always taught to believe and what your heart is trying to tell you, please, let me know this story is reaching you by giving it a like and turning on your notifications. It's a quiet way of saying, I understand that battle. I couldn't live like that, suspended in the torment between the woman I had been and the wreckage I had become. The silence from the God of my pulpits was still absolute, a closed heaven. But the silence that had followed the vision in the hospital room, that silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. It was an invitation. One night, about a month after I'd come home, I couldn't take it anymore. David was asleep, his steady breathing filling the dark room. The house was quiet. Tiptoeing, my legs still aching, I found my purse and my car keys. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there. My hands, seemingly with a will of their own, steered the car through the sleeping town, past the familiar sight of my own church, the chapel of the unvarnished truth, and parked across the street from the one place on earth I had sworn I would never, ever enter, St. Jude Catholic Church. For a long time I just sat there in the dark, my engine off, watching the moonlight trace the silhouette of its steeple. Every fiber of my being, every sermon I had ever preached, every scripture I had ever memorized, screamed at me to start the car and go home. This is the house of idols, Jeanette. This is the heart of the great deception. Flee from it. But the memory of those gentle hands, mending what I had so violently broken, was stronger than 30 years of doctrine. I got out of the car. My legs felt like they were filled with lead. I crossed the empty street, half expecting to be struck by lightning. The heavy wooden doors were old, imposing. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed. They were unlocked. The door groaned open, and the sound echoed in a vast, silent space. The air inside was cool and thick with smells that were alien to me. Old wax, the faint, sweet ghost of incense, and something else. Something ancient and holy. It wasn't the clean, modern scent of my church. It was the smell of centuries of prayer. Rows of votive candles flickered in a metal stand in a corner, hundreds of tiny flames dancing in red and blue glass cups. They looked like souls. They looked like prayers made visible. My eyes adjusted to the gloom and were drawn to a small alcove on the side of the sanctuary. And there she was, a statue of Mary, carved from dark wood, her hands outstretched, her head tilted with a look of profound sorrow and compassion. She was smaller than the one in the square, but the feeling was the same. The old pastor rose up in me, a final venomous whisper in my mind. Graven image, you shall bow down to no idol. This is a test. I felt a physical wave of revulsion, a lifetime of programming making my stomach churn. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I wanted to turn and run, to escape back to the safety of my own certainties. But I thought of the nurse's silver medal. I thought of the pearlescent light in my hospital room. I took one painful step forward, then another. Soon I was standing directly before the statue, my heart a raging battlefield. But as I looked up, I wasn't looking at an idol. My mind was screaming, wood and paint. But my heart was looking at the face of a mother. I saw the sorrow in her carved eyes, the very same sorrow I had felt radiating from the light. It was a sorrow for me. For her foolish, arrogant, broken child. Slowly, as if lifting a 1,000-pound weight, I lifted my right hand. It shook violently. My fingers reached out and brushed against the cool, smooth wood of her outstretched hand. And in that one, simple moment of contact, the war inside me stopped. The pride, the anger, the 30 years of rigid certainty. It all just dissolved and fell away like dust. It wasn't a surrender to an idol. It was a surrender of my own brokenness into the hands of a mercy I could not understand, a love I had done everything in my power to reject, but that had pursued me into my darkest hour anyway. All I could do was stand there, my hand resting on the wood, and weep. Not with shame this time, but with a quiet, shattering relief. I was home. Leaving the church that night was like waking from a 30-year dream. The world looked the same moon, the same quiet streets. But I was seeing it with new eyes. I went home, And for the first time in my marriage, I had a secret. Not a secret of sin, but a secret of grace. And I didn't know how to share it. The news, of course, found its own way out. In a small town, a pastor's wife seen entering the Catholic Church in the dead of night is not a story that stays quiet for long. David confronted me a few days later, his face a mask of pained confusion. He held my hands, his knuckles white. "Jeanette, my love, what is this? People are talking. They're saying you've fallen into the snare, the accident, the trauma. The enemy is preying on you." I looked into the eyes of the man I had built a life and a ministry with, and I saw not a husband, but a gatekeeper to a prison I had just escaped. "David," I said, my voice quiet but steady, "I had an experience in the hospital." I told him everything. The light, the hands, the roses, the overwhelming sense of a mother's love. I watched his face shift from concern to alarm, and then to a deep, doctrinal horror. "A feminine presence? Jeanette, that is a classic spirit of deception. A Jezebel spirit sent to pull you from the truth." He opened his Bible, his hands flying to the verses we had so often used to condemn others, and he began to preach at me, right there in our living room. My own sermons, my own weapons, were now being turned on me. The fallout was swift and brutal. Members of our church, people I had baptized and counseled, came to our house. Some pleaded with me, tears in their eyes, begging me to renounce this spirit. Others were angry, accusing me of betraying everything we had built, of making a mockery of our ministry. They told me it was a hallucination from the painkillers. They said it was a psychological break caused by the crash. They tried to reason with me, to argue theology with me, to scare me back into the fold. And to each of them, I had only one answer, spoken not with fire and brimstone, but with a peace that infuriated them. "I understand why you believe that," I'd say. "But what I experienced was more real than this chair I'm sitting on. It was the most real thing that has ever happened to me. My refusal to argue, to engage in the spiritual warfare I had once championed, was the most damning evidence of all. To them, I wasn't just wrong. I was lost. Within a month, I was no longer Pastor Jeanette. I was just Jeanette, the woman who had lost her mind, the woman who had been deceived. The loneliness was a physical weight, but I was not alone. One afternoon, there was a knock on my door. It was Miss Eleanor. She stood on my porch, holding not a Bible, but a covered casserole dish. She didn't look triumphant or smug. Her eyes were just kind. "I heard you were recovering," she said simply. "I thought you might like some company." She came in, and we sat in the living room where I had been spiritually cross-examined so many times. She didn't ask me about the vision. She didn't ask me about the church. She just asked how my leg was healing. And then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple wooden rosary. She didn't preach. She just held it out to me. "Sometimes," she said softly, "when you don't have the words to pray, the beads do the praying for you." I looked at the string of beads I had once mocked with such venom, and I saw not an idol, but an anchor. I took it from her, and my fingers, which had once smashed porcelain in rage, closed around the small wooden cross. In that quiet act of acceptance, I found my new community. It wasn't in a building. It was in a shared understanding of a mercy that defies all logic. My true testimony, however, couldn't remain behind closed doors. Our town has an annual Founders' Day picnic in the square, an event meant to bring everyone together. This year, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. My old congregation was on one side of the lawn, David leading them in prayer. The St. Jude parishioners were on the other, and I was in the middle, a woman belonging to neither and to both. The mayor got up to say a few words, and then he said, "We've had a difficult year with some division, but we're a community, and I think there's someone here who has something she'd like to share." He looked right at me. 100 faces turned in my direction. David's eyes pleaded with me not to. Miss Eleanor's gave me a gentle nod of encouragement. Shaking, I walked to the small makeshift stage. I looked out at the crowd, at the people who had loved me, and the people who had feared me. "My name is Jeanette," I began, my voice trembling. "And for 30 years, from a pulpit just a few blocks from here, I taught you what I believed was the unvarnished truth. But my truth was a very small, very hard box, and I was angry at anyone who wouldn't get in it with me." I looked directly at Miss Eleanor. "I owe this town, and especially my Catholic neighbors, an apology. I was arrogant, I was cruel, and I was so blind." My eyes found David's. I believed I was a warrior for God, but I was just a warrior for my own pride. I took a deep breath. On the day I destroyed the statue that stood right over there, I thought I was making a point about God. But God, in His infinite mercy, decided to make a point about me. He showed me that my strength was a fortress of sand, and that I was as broken as the plaster I shattered on the ground. He let me fall, so that He could show me who would be there to catch me. My voice cracked, but I pushed on. "The very thing I taught you to hate, the very symbol I destroyed in my self-righteousness, a mother's love. That is what lifted me from the floor of a hospital room. That is what began to piece my soul back together. I haven't changed religions. I've changed hearts. I've learned that God's mercy is bigger than any church, and it often reaches us through the very hands we refuse to take." I stepped down from the stage into a profound, stunned silence, and then a single sound broke it. It was Miss Eleanor clapping, and then another person, and another. I didn't care who was clapping and who wasn't. For the first time, I felt free. My story isn't about becoming Catholic. It's about becoming human. It's about being found in the wreckage of your own certainty. It's about the shattering of pride to make way for a love that will hunt you down with the ferocity of a mother who has lost her child. If this story of a heart being broken open has touched your own, if you believe in a mercy that can find us even when we are its sworn enemy, please let your like on this video be a small amen to that truth. Ring that notification bell so we can continue this journey together. And I truly want to build a community right here in the comments, a testament to this incredible grace. So please, share one word, just one, that describes what mercy means to you. Let's fill this space with 1,000 reasons why hope is never, ever lost. Thank you for listening.